Antong Lucky is an activist, advocate, and public speaker concentrating in the areas of mentoring Black men and boys, bridging the gap between community and police, and developing and launching violence reduction strategies, criminal justice reform, and reentry initiatives for formerly incarcerated people. Beverly Aarons is a writer, artist, and game developer. She works across disciplines exploring the intersections of history, hidden current realities, and imagined future worlds. She is the winner of numerous awards, including the Community for Culture Fellowship, Artist Trust Gap Award, and the Seattle Office of Arts and Culture Smart Ventures Grant, among others. She is currently publishing in-depth artist profiles at Artist Up Close on Substack. Please join me in welcoming Beverly Aarons and Antong Lucky.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you, Anton. And I'm just going to put your book up here so folks can see, oh man, my background isn't working the way it's, you see it? All right, that's the book.
Thank you.
Redemptive path forward. Let's jump right in because we don't have a lot of time. Reading this book was really a transformative experience for me. It wasn't mentioned in my bio, but I grew up in Chicago on the South Side in the 80s. So I am definitely familiar with what it's like to live in a community that is suffering from gang violence and crime. So when I read your book, it really brought back a lot of memories. It was very touching. So I just wanted to start off with that. And I kind of want to start our conversation in the beginning. In your book, you talked about growing up at Fraser Courts in South Dallas, in the East Dallas neighborhood, right?
Right.
And something that really stood out in your book was that you said that you had a lot of cognitive distortions during childhood. And I wanted you to talk about that and talk about what those cognitive distortions were during your childhood in East Dallas.
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you, Beth, for having me. Thank you for this whole platform. I'm blessed and honored to be a part and have this conversation with you. And I know you is the GOAT because I've looked you up. You're an amazing artist. So I'm blessed, I'm blessed to be here in this space with you. But when I talk about the cognitive distortions that I encountered growing up, I'm talking about specifically all of the subcultural norms that you internalize as a young person in that kind of community, like the stuff that you learn, the stuff that's being taught to you, that subculture that's that you and that group of familiar people share together, and a lot of times those norms are against mainstream norms. When I'm talking about learning to sell drugs, or this whole idea of this gang membership and affiliation. I'm talking specifically about that, and just the subculture norms that you observe as a kid that's happening in your environment that you later find out that you have to change or you have to challenge, et cetera, et cetera. Some of the stuff that I've seen in my household with my mother and my stepfather, the fights, all that stuff that you internalize because as a kid, you process that information in a way that, even if it's against how you feel, you can internalize it and it can be controlling how you respond. And so that's what I was talking about when I was talking about my cognitive distortion that I later on had to address and face and challenge.
Do you see a different set of cognitive distortions in the community that you're working in right now with the youth? How is that the same? How is it different?
Well, it's the same because I think we've never emphatically pronounced or challenge some of the stuff that's in the subculture of communities now. You know, I take, for instance, uh, the relationship as it relates to police and community, right? We never challenge that stuff. Or the relationship as it relates to crime, violence that happened in the community, you know, that nobody says nothing, clause. We don't address that. We don't challenge that. And it's more that we just challenge that continue to just be a part of our communities. And our kids grow up as a result, repeating the same cycle that we've seen for many, many years until someone challenges those norms or those distortions, then you can pave a path forward.
How have you been challenging those distortions with the youth that you're working with today?
Repeat that again.
How are you challenging those cognitive distortions with the youth that you're working with today?
Okay, I will give you an example. Like most young people growing up in our communities, especially in the urban communities, that's, you know, that stripped of resources, et cetera. They have this idea. I'm gonna give you an example. They had this toxic idea of masculinity for men. You know, men, we all been talking. Men, you have to be tough. You can't show feelings, and you got to be macho, and et cetera, et cetera. We never ever, well, I guess we do, question what do that do? What do that type of thinking have on a young person? Or how that type of thinking goes into a young person. We never address that. And so for me, what I learned, you know, when I was in prison, when I was challenging myself, was that because we taught that you don't want to be vulnerable. You know, being vulnerable is being weak. You know, even if I have a little cousin, I went up to his school just not too long ago because his father's in prison, and the teacher called me up there. When I sat with my little cousin, I talked to him. He was only like 7, 8 years old, and I took him out and said, "What's wrong?" He said, "This kid was picking on me," and he kept picking on me because I taught him what to do whenever in that situation. I said, "So what did you do?" He said, "I told the teacher." I said, "Then what happened?" He said, "She told me that little boys ain't supposed to tell, you know, quit telling." And so when the little bully kid kept messing with him and he got into a confrontation with the young person, they wanted to suspend him. But he did everything he was supposed to do. And just the idea that, hey, little boy ain't supposed, you think does to a young person. Little boys ain't supposed, you quit being a telltale. But he trying to let the teacher know that this kid is, well, we never think about how these ideas, how we internalize these ideas that are predominant in our culture that we never challenge. You know, and for me, when I was in prison, I was looking into the mirror. I had to challenge that stuff because I wanted to know. I wanted to be very introspective to understand how did I go from a good kid, honor roll, talented and gifted kid, to a judge calling me a menace to society. I wanted to understand that because as he was telling me that I was a menace to society, I was sitting there having a conversation in my head that went sort of like, "But Judge, you don't understand. I'm from East Dallas. It's tough over there. You got to be tough." But that's not who I am. I was just playing this role, et cetera, et cetera. But that conversation never came out of my mouth. And I understand it's a lot of young people, talented young people in our communities who were just like me, who was smart, talented little kids, but the environment snuffed away that creativity. It snuffed away those ideas because kids had amputating their personalities, who they really are, and layering themselves with all these distortions to be something else just to survive. And I think we have to always challenge that. We have to always create ways where kids can show up and be their authentic self, that they can have feelings, you know. And I understood in prison when I shedded all those layers that had been laid on me over the years as a child, that's where I found my strength. See, we had been tricked to think that vulnerability means you're weak, but in actuality, vulnerability is a sign of strength. And so I go back into communities trying to teach kids that it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to unlayer, because child inside of us who is a good child, who is a wholesome child, but encountered something in the environment, some stimuli that made us go into our shell and become something else. And that's a situation that happens. And if you're not keen, you won't see that. You have to be very keen to be able to see that.
And so when you were a 1-year-old baby, your father was incarcerated for 50 years for aggravated robbery, right? And you were growing up in Dallas, in East Dallas, Fraser Court. And let's talk about Rodney. Rodney was a close friend of yours. You were growing up, he was you were an innocent kid. Rodney was like innocent, but he didn't really have even the family, the mom or anything in his life, right? And you were already in deep with your cousins in that culture of toughness, right?
Right.
And your cousins challenged you to attack your best friend, Rodney.
Right.
And you did it.
I'd never forget that. That to this day, I think about that because, again, me and Rodney, we walked to and from school every day. It was my friend. Like, this was really my friend. But my cousin, I neglected to mention, my cousins were brutal. My cousins, I don't know, my cousin was brutal. They were the bullies. And so in my family, my name, Lucky, we had a big family. So it was a lot of us, all of our names, Lucky. So we were the most menacing, well, our name was the most menacing name in the neighborhood. And so my cousin would pick on kids, they would do all that stuff. And I would try to, I was walking this line trying to, I didn't like it, but I couldn't, I didn't have the courage to confront it at the time. I didn't have the courage to confront it. And so so I was kind of on the outskirts of it, but I was there. I benefited from everything they did, but I didn't have the courage to confront it. And that day that they faced me and Rodney together and put 2 sticks on our shoulder, man, I remember having butterflies in my stomach and feeling like I felt this. This is a sickening feeling that I felt. But I felt like I had to go on with it. I couldn't, I had nothing in me, no wherewithal to say, no, I don't want to this, et cetera, et cetera. I had to go on, I had to go and play this part. And me and Rodney, we got into a fight. And afterwards, I felt so bad. I felt bad because that was my friend. And in that situation, it turned me. It turned me. I felt bad, and a month later, as I talk about in the book, the teacher says Rodney drowned, and that was my first understanding. Well, that was my second understanding of death. My first understanding a friend of mine is no longer gonna be here with us, and I felt like God was punishing me for not having the courage that particular day to confront it, remove myself from that situation.
And that's hard for a kid to do, right? I mean,
Yes.
you're living in the environment that you are raised in. I'm
Right.
definitely familiar with the idea of being tough, which I think is applied to boys a lot more than girls, at least when I was growing up. So I completely relate to what you're saying, and I've seen that play out. And so my question would be, when we look back at what you said earlier about that teacher who came to that kid and was like, well, you're not supposed to tattletale. How do you move youth towards vulnerability in a system? And I'm talking about a cultural
Right.
system, Black
Right.
community on a bigger, on one scale, but also the individual neighborhoods and the
Right.
schools. Like, how do you do that when there is this structure there that when there are all these beliefs that aren't being acknowledged even, or even, and definitely not
Right.
addressed?
We definitely have to begin. I think the way even schooling, we just start right there. Even with schooling, policing, way we do community, we definitely have to reimagine how we do that. The old way of the system structure is ineffective, and we have to admit that. And so you have to have individuals who have proximity and who have expertise to begin teaching systems like school systems, police systems, different ways. You have to begin that because the old way don't work, and sometimes, and the problem is sometimes those individuals who teach, they may not have the accreditation or the accolades or the degrees that the other people have. And I think to a certain degree that creates this kind of professional jealousy. And tell you what I mean by that. But it has to be about results. Results matter, So when you're talking to a school system who says, this is the only way we do this, we have to begin to have conversations to say, now it's different ways that we do that, And one of the ways that we found, and I've cut my teeth on, I talk about it in the book, is in this whole idea of redemption, right? This whole idea of redemption and transformation is possible. Redemptive activism. I talk about that because I think in our current conversations, we condemn our views, and our perception is so condemnatory that we condemn people, places, things, et cetera, et cetera. Why I say that is in 2000, and we can go back, but in 2000, we did the first gang peace treaty in Dallas, right? We had 400 young people to commit to peace, right? And so these young people, it was a tedious process. We got to commit to peace. And then the first day of school, principal at this particular school suspended 45 students on the first day, right? Me and my partner in time in crime, Bishop Omar, who's late Bishop Omar, who passed last year, who was my mentor, who taught me everything I know. We saw those young people treated with. We put them in the van and we took them back to the school. And we said to the principal at that school that these young people need to be in school. That if you kick them out for the rest of the year, what you expect is gonna happen. You know what's gonna happen. Give them a shot. Make us responsible for them, and let's see what happens. And that principal took us on our word. And so what we did, we took guys from the neighborhood who we've been working with. Some of these guys were ex-felons, been to prison, but they had changed. They had changed. Their character has changed. They wanted to help. And we put them guys in the school as hall monitors, right? As hall monitors. See, it's hard to be, and let me tell you just the thought behind it. It's hard to be a bully if you're a big homie in the school, or your big brother, your big cousin. It's hard to walk around being tough and all that when you got your big homie saying, take your butt to class, right? And so what had happened was, Beverly, what happened,
Sorry.
we did that for 3 years straight, right? With these guys and girls from those communities that those kids came from, those teams came from. And the University of Minnesota did a blind study we had no knowledge of till later, where they said prior to us coming into the school, they had 395 violent gang incidents every year. When we came into the school, for the next 3 years, the incident was reduced to 1 or maybe 2 incidents per year. See, that's results. Those are results. That principal looked at a different way of addressing the system. And the only variable was that we put some people in the school. Everything else stayed the same. Academics went up, attendance went up, extracurricular activities went up. Teachers were able to teach as opposed to breaking up fights. They could teach because our guys were walking the hall, and anytime you had someone that's acting up, they big cousin or big brother would walk in the classroom and everything come. And so those are kind of ways that we have to begin to address these systems, so that because we can't do it the old way. We have to look at different ways of engaging and different ways of impacting our community. And I talk about that, throughout the book. Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about that peace agreement when you first attempted to bring the gangs together, and how some of those gang members were like, actually, you got to pay us, right?
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
they thought that you had money, you had access to big money, and the perception around money, right? Like this idea when you're living in what we used to call, I don't hear people using this word anymore, but I still use the word ghetto, because that's what it is. You're just like, it's a ghetto, you're segregated, you're in this box away from the rest of society. So you get these ideas about how the world works that isn't really in alignment with reality. So they thought that you were connected to this big money, and that they should get paid to bring peace. And when I looked at that, and I said, that's capitalism, right? Yeah. Right. That's their version of capitalism, right? Like this is value that I'm bringing. I'm going to bring some valuable piece to the situation, and you're going to pay me.
Yes.
So I want to talk about like what your thoughts are about how capitalism is a big part of these communities in how capitalism is a part of these communities, and how these communities operate, and how the youth in the community operate.
Right. And I will be the first to say that I'm not anti-capitalism, and I believe capitalism works, et cetera, right? But I think with that situation, when we was, see, one thing Bishop Omar used to say, right? He used to teach this. He used to say to the guys that we was engaging with, he would say, if you change your character, then your characteristics would have a market advantage in this economy, right? Applying the principles of a market economy, right? So they was on the right, they had the right idea, right? But their character hadn't changed. So by their character not changing, then their characteristics weren't gonna work. They would have the wrong characteristics. See, if they would have understood what we were saying back then, it was you have to love, care, and understand all of that. You have to understand all that, and then those dollars and that value that you bring, you have to prove that value. You have to prove that value, and if you prove that value, then of course it's systems that need you. It's school systems that can hire you. It's juvenile places that can hire you just based off your background and based off the experience you've been through. But you have to change. You can't get over changing the character part, because you got the wrong character and you got the wrong product. So we knew that. These was all my friends who we were having this conversation with. And I remember that day in Boston Market, man, when they left, I was feeling so let down, like we failed, because it was only like 2 or 3 that stayed. And I remember Bishop Omar, man, he was like, this was success. We just won. And I was like, was he just in the meeting I was in? They just told us we had to pay them $9,000. But it was good though. It was good because I think I became that it worked, because when I was having that conversation, when we was having that conversation with them, you know, it was strictly about my passion. It was strictly about, when I first met Bishop Omar, I said, look, I want to go to my neighborhood and I want to rectify some of the stuff that I caused. I want to change the trajectory of young people in my neighborhood so that they don't follow in my footsteps. And Omar looked me dead in my face and he said, let's go to your enemies and ask them for peace. And I remember looking at him saying, well, hold up, brother, I didn't think that far in the process. I was talking about my neighborhood. But he was testing me, right? He was testing me. And I said, brother, I said, don't you know that's suicide? The last time these brothers saw me, I was shooting at them and they were shooting at me. And you telling me to walk unarmed into that neighborhood and ask for peace? I said, brother, that's suicide. And I didn't know him at the time, but Omar convinced me, but he convinced me to do that. And we ended up in enemy territory at the time, unarmed, and I was with him. I didn't know him well, but he was very persuasive. And at my enemy door, I'll never forget that, Bev. It was in the summer, it was hot. It was a one-way in, one-way out apartment complex, and it looked dangerous. I'm talking about just looking at it, it was dangerous. And Omar, he convinced me, right? I'm fresh out of prison. He convinced me. And I remember knocking on the door, right? And as I'm knocking on the door, well, he was knocking on the door. And they looked out the blind. You see the blinds crack, right? And they said, oh shit, that's Kiddo. That's my nickname, right? And all you heard was feet shuffling and guns cocking, right? And Omar said, he told me, he said, put your hands up. So I put my hands up and he put his hands up. And when they opened up the door, it was like 7, 8 guys with guns pointing at us, right? Pointing at me, rather. And before I could say, they said, what you doing here? And before I can say something, Omar started talking, right? And as he talking, I got my hands up, Bev, and I'm saying, God, I know you didn't bring me this far to kill me. I know you to say how the story is. I'm praying. And I'm praying. And as Omar was talking, they were lowering their guns. And I'm saying to myself, like, man, please keep talking, brother. Please. I don't know him. And he was talking, he was telling them that I wanted peace and that we were trying to change the community. We want to give these babies an opportunity, et cetera, et cetera. And as he was talking, they were lowering their guns, man. And they then gave us permission to work with their younger brothers and sisters towards this peace process, man. And that was kind of like the first time that just really opened my eyes to the power of transformation, redemption, et cetera, that we could do it. You know, that was the first time. But go ahead.
Oh, I was going to ask you just one of the things that stood out in the book was, yes, that moment when Omar and you were in you know, opposing gang territory, right? Or dangerous territory, because you weren't in the gang at the time, but still people perceived you that way, right? And that's another, we have time, that's another thing I want to talk about is that reputation, right? How difficult that is to overcome. But what stood out to me in your journey is that you've worked across political lines, gang lines, neighborhood lines, all types of borders, class lines, right? To make this a reality of improving South Dallas, right? East Dallas. East Dallas is actually a neighborhood in South Dallas, which is like really confusing. So I just want to confirm that for folks who are not from Texas. And I'm not from Texas either, so it took me a minute to figure it out. So tell me about those surprising connections. I know one person that might be surprising to some people is that you ended up connecting to Paul Ryan at one point, right? And Elizabeth Koch, right? And Coke. I totally murdered it. Coke.
Yeah.
And also the billionaire Ron Williams. Right? Don Williams.
Yeah.
Yes. And so these are not people that you would imagine when you were 14 years old getting, you know, the Bloods started in Dallas, that you would be connecting to help you bring about this new vision for South Dallas and the East Dallas neighborhood. Tell me about what you had to overcome internally to be willing to make those connections to those people.
Yes, I think that's a good question. I think it started in my childhood, but most importantly, it started in prison, to be able to get to where you just talked about, right? In prison, right? One thing I did, like I said, when the judge sentenced me, I became self-introspective from that day, from the day he sentenced me. I wanted to know, as I mentioned earlier, how did I get to this point? How did I get, and so I went into prison like that. And one of the things that I did while I was in prison, I looked in that stainless steel mirror at myself, and I wanted to address those distortions. I wanted to understand who was looking at who in this mirror, right? And I had to accept a lot of stuff. I had to hold I could have blamed the system. I could have blamed my father. I could have blamed my mother. I could have blamed a whole bunch of, I had a whole laundry list of people to blame as to why I was there. I skirted all that, and I became accountable to myself. I accepted responsibility for the choice that I made, intentional, unintentional. I accepted full responsibility. I addressed all of the distortions. I addressed that. I unlayered all of the layers, and I got back to that little boy. I got back to being a human being. I got back to having feelings, et cetera, right? And so for me, right, in prison is separated by race. You know that, right? Blacks, white men, you don't mix. And as I'm going through my transformation process in prison, right, I'm getting back to who I was, to the core of who we all are as human beings, that we share. We share one thing in common, that we human beings. And so everything else is labels. Everything else is layers, right? But we human beings, right? And so when you become vulnerable and you address that stuff, most people don't like to, because taking off those layers and becoming naked, it's not a good feeling. And so, but for me, it was something that I wanted to experience, because I wanted to be 100% authentic with myself. I went into prison. Tupac had Live and Die in LA, and he was our prophet. Learn about the West Coast, B's and C's, these other dudes, copycats, D's to G's. When Tupac said that, he hurt my soul. I said, oh my goodness, Pac said it. And so I said to myself, we started the Bloods because other kids in our neighborhoods were Crips. They were identified with gangs. We saw colors. That movie, Bloods and Crip movie that was happening in California, and we emulated that. The gangbanging went our culture in Texas. We emulated what we saw was happening on the West Coast and sometimes on the East Coast. And we became Blood. I had to accept that. I had to be real with myself and say, that's how it happened, because I'm being real with myself. And so as I begin to be real with myself, I get to shed all this stuff, right? And so in prison, I was fortunate enough to have money on my books. I like to talk about this. I had money on my books. So in prison, when you spread, you have food, you throw it away. You don't give it to nobody else. You throw it away, because if they're not a part of your tribe, which I felt that was stupid as I started to re-educate myself, right? It's like, well, I'm throwing away a bucket of food. I know people in here ain't ate. And so what I would do, I would go, and after we was eat, I would just ask people around the dorm, I would give them food. And ain't nobody gonna turn down no food from commissary if they eating out the chow hall. I don't care who they are, how mad they gonna eat the food. And so through that, I began to make friends. Because at this point, I'm teaching, I'm educating. I'm a young 19, 20-year-old brother. I done read every book in the library, and I'm educating, I'm taking that knowledge and I'm sharing it with grown men who like 40, 50 years old, who really like listening to me, right? And so I remember this to your point, I remember this one encounter that I had with this guy. He was a white guy. He was one of the ranking members of the Aryan Brotherhood, right? And one day we in the corner having a conversation. The conversation started off me feeding him and others, And we in a conversation, I remember brothers looking on my peripheral, like, what in the hell is Luck doing talking to the Adrian guy? And this guy got tattoos from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. He got swastikas, lightning bolts, and looked like somebody hanging from a tree. I'm assuming it's probably a black person.
Wow.
The whole 9 yards, right? And me and him sitting in the corner having a conversation, but it started from me offering that food, right? And so as I started to have a conversation with him, I began to realize that he had the same hopes and aspirations that I had, right? I began to realize that he had been buried with those cognitive distortions and those layers that I had, right? I began to realize that it was a little boy, a good little boy trapped inside of him, who was just as afraid as the little boy I was afraid. It was in him. And so I started to realize, right? I said, this guy got tattoos from his whole face, head, everything. And I started to realize that the tattoos, one, because he was a mean person, as we was perceive him to be, the tattoos were just like the porcupine. He had the tattoos to scare you off. He wanted to scare you away from the little boy that was inside of him that was afraid, just like I was when I put on, I'm a talented, gifted, honor-roll student, and I put on this cloak called gang stuff and to hide that little boy in me. The little boy who was scared to confront my cousins when they made me fight Rodney. The little boy who was scared to confront some more of my cousins when we was at another school who beat up the little Ethiopian kid who was my best friend in the classroom, and I didn't have the courage to confront. See, that little boy exists in all of us. That little boy, little girl, that child, that innocent, it exists in all of us, but we layer it with how we orient, how society oriented, give us these labels, and then before we look, we so separated by these labels. He Aryan, he a blood, he Texas Cinder, he a gangster disciple, he a Latin king. We are willing to kill each other because of these polarizations called labels that's on us. So for me, when I understood that, when I understood these labels, when I understood the cognitive distortions, and I understood that at the core of humanity is this shared sense of humanity, et cetera, the labels no longer define how I view. I no longer look at an individual and write them off because of these labels that I got. That's why the work that we do with young people, I can see a young person that the other person would say, nah, he a gang member, he off, he this and that. But when I see a young person, I see me. I see that little kid who was saying, man, can somebody help me understand what I'm going through? Can somebody lead my hand through this terrain? Can somebody, I see that when I see people. And so with that knowledge there and beginning to teach in prison and having Bloods and Crips who hated each other, now sitting at the table discussing philosophy, we talking about Socrates and Plato, and we talking about the cave, and we just talking about a whole bunch of stuff. It gave me a microcosm view that these labels separate us. If we can ever have some proximity, we can bring not just our neighborhoods, but we can bring this country together. And so for me, meeting Paul Ryan and us saying, what do we agree on and what do we officially agree on? Regardless, I'm not gonna agree with everything you say. I'm not gonna agree with everything Charles Koch say. But what do we agree on that we can work on that can help somebody else? And so that became my modus operandi for the kind of activism that I espouse in the country, is finding those where we can find what we agree on and how do we work together to move us forward. That's why my book, A Redemptive Path Forward, because I believe we've all done something that we don't care to admit, to be judged harshly or condemned by something that happened in the past. We should have the inalienable right to modify, to adjust. And so when we introduce that into the conversation, when we see each other as human beings, when we challenge system with love, justice, courage, and redemption, then we begin to move forward from these same cliches or these same stereotypes or these same polarizations that keep us dug in our heel and not coming together like we should be. So that's why I can work with Charles Koch, I can work with Paul Ryan, because I don't have permanent parties. I got
What
permanent,
about
the reputation
that you got as Lucky when you
right.
were being processed, when you were you had gone to, I think it was the club with your cousins and some of their friends, and there was something that happened, and then you ended up getting booked into juvie, and they
Right.
said another Lucky.
Right.
And
Right.
that's kind of followed you even after prison, like even in prison, when you said you weren't in a gang, and your friend was like, no, you're definitely, you are in a gang. I don't care what you say. And then when you started doing the work in the community, you had a police officer make up stories about you because he didn't trust you. He didn't have any evidence on not trusting you. So he made something up.
Right.
How did you regain the trust of the community?
By perpetually waking up every day saying, I'm gonna continue to walk in my truth regardless. I'm gonna be like Malcolm X. I'm gonna search for truth no matter where I find it. And I'm gonna walk in it every single day. And that's not to say that all of the challenges that's out there gonna disappear, because they didn't. It wasn't easy. It's not a quick get rich scheme. This is character, principle, choices that you make every single day. And I had to make those. I still get challenged at every intersection. I'm being challenged. But when you know who you are, like Viktor Frankl say, when you find your how, your why, your how is easy. But it's just about how do you finding that why, and my why is I want to be the epitome and the embodiment of redemption and transformation, so that a young person in the community know that if I follow these steps, and if he did it, I can do it. Some father in prison trying to figure out what's his next move. This stuff, I didn't have this stuff mapped out when I left prison. I didn't have it mapped out. I was just believing that if I had the faith that if I continued doing it and making these steps, that doors were gonna open. And that's exactly what happened. Doors open, no matter what trap,
when did people begin to trust you though? What moment? What did you, because obviously you can say I walk in my truth, but that is not concrete. Like if you just say I walk in my truth, and people are like, what does that mean? Tell us, what does that look like? Like what did you do to regain the trust besides walking your truth? Like what were the steps that you actually took to regain the trust of the community?
Beverly,
give it to me. Give me the specifics. Give me one specific.
Now, Beverly, I'm gonna tell you, I've always I have integrity, transparent. I have guiding principles that I live by, and I just truly live by those guiding principles. Like you can go anywhere, not just in Dallas, but let's just use Dallas for an example. It's a lot of stuff that I do privately for people, to help people, because I truly believe that I get blessed by me, each one, reach one, teach one. That's what I live by. So I'm always helping people. So I'm never gonna have, I can never even think that everybody that come in contact with me will follow my lead or trust me, et cetera, et cetera. You're gonna have that. I worry about the people that I help, or the people that's blessed by my interaction, that's moving forward. And I just continue to do it. Wherever I can help people, I help people. It's a lot of examples that I can give, but I don't feel like, they don't feel good saying that. But it's a lot of examples, actions that I've taken to gain the trust of people. They know one thing: if I call Antong, he gonna come. I just recently, a mother reached out to me. Her daughter was missing for sex trafficking for 26 days, right? And the community tagged me, reached out to me. The sister couldn't get no help. Immediately we got on the news. Immediately we canvassing, looking for a daughter, et cetera, et cetera. And that's no fanfare, and that mother was able to get her daughter back, and that wasn't something publicly I did. That was all the stuff that was private. But to that mother, if you went to that mother and said, what you think about Mr. Lucky? I probably can bet what she'd probably say, because of my actions that I did privately with her, not public stuff, but the private stuff. And I do a lot of that stuff. So building trust and gaining trust of the community is more so about being a representative and someone who bring who bring resources, someone who exposes an individual, someone who always provide the type of mentorship that people need to get ahead for upward mobility. That's all I do. You know, that's my life is I
So it
want to do
sounds
something else,
like
but I can't.
and so it sounds like you have built up these intimate interactions, these intimate relationships with people. We know this stuff doesn't get pressed
Right,
because, right,
right,
the cameras aren't there,
right,
and that's a whole nother conversation. So you may do that with 10 people one month, 20 the next, and then over it's been
20,
20 years.
22 years,
It's
22
been
years.
22 years that you've been in this work. That's a long time. So
Yes,
you're building up that trust. And so the people
right,
that
right.
know you in that community trust you, and it's a reputation. And that's what it sounds like you're saying.
Say what you mean and mean what you say. That's the motto. Say what you mean and mean what you say, and have integrity, and everything else work itself out. And that's kind of how I've been in this space, Bev. I've been there for real. I've never 22 years. I've never promoted messages that were anti-community, anti-people. I never done none of that stuff, violence, none of that stuff. I don't use my platform for that stuff. I don't even watch that stuff. I'm always about positivity. I'm always about removing barriers. I'm always about people upward mobility, because I truly believe that if you help somebody else, it helps you. Not the old way, dog eat dog. I believe that when you help other people, it helps you.
We
You know, I
have
can't.
a question from the community. I want to interject here, so because we've kind of
Okay.
gone over a little bit over
You know,
time.
okay.
So there's one question from a viewer, and it says, how do we support work like this in our own communities?
I'm quite sure whatever community you in, therein exists people who may not get the public acknowledgement,
Exactly.
but are doing the work. Like when I go around the country, I go straight to the community and I ask, who doing the work? And it never fails. If someone is doing the work, just like how what Beverly asked me, how do you get the trust? The community gonna say who really doing the work. And they'll tell you who ain't doing the work and acting like they doing the work. But the community know, the people know who doing the work. And so find those individuals, because they in your community, they doing the work and they doing it quietly and they getting it done. And they don't have the fanfare. But find those people and support them. Come into the work and support them, because people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And that's with anything.
And I think that's a really important point. And I would even add that you have to actually be inside the community, interacting with ordinary, everyday people, right?
True.
Because otherwise,
True.
you're only gonna hear the loudest voices, right?
Right.
All right. So, and I'll take the questions as they're coming, but I did have another question for you, because you mentioned something earlier that hinted at something that I did want to discuss with you: the violence, right? You don't support the violence. You don't use your platform, right? Let's talk about hip hop and the transformation of hip hop, and the Stop the Violence movement in 1980s. I think it was 1989, and hip hop was at a crossroads, right? It was like you had Public Enemy, you had uplifting rap, and then you had gangster rap. Well, obviously gangster rap went out, right? Can you talk about the impact of cultural products such as music, movies, on youth, the minds of youth?
Right. It's so many. I'm glad you asked that question, because it's so much research that's out there, right? I'm gonna give you a prime example. I just said to you some moments ago that here in Texas, we watched the movie Colors in the theater.
Right.
And when that movie came out, 1989, 88, 89, when that movie hit the theaters worldwide, gang membership exploded across the country. There go your answer right there. That's the answer.
I mean, I know the
There go
answer. I'm just saying it for everybody else. I mean, because I lived it, right? Like so I lived it, and we have a lot in common in the sense that we both grew up in Black communities in the 80s. You know, I think I may be actually a little bit older than you. And, you know, but I can't, no one is listening, no one listens, right? The impact that this is having on Black children's minds to listen to this music. You know, I was doing some research, Anton, before we met, because I was like, oh, we don't have much time to talk. Am I going to be able to get off into all this different stuff? But the suicide rate of Black youth has gone through the roof. And I thought about it, and I was like, would I feel depressed if I was a young Black girl, you know, or a young Black boy growing up now? And I'm like, yes. If you listen just to the music, it's depressing, right? There's nothing like life-giving about the music. So what are you doing? Like, you talked a little bit about it in your book with some of the young people, trying to encourage them to find that humanity in themselves instead of emulating this I'm just going to call it what it is, nonsense. How do you do that? How do you help make that shift in your community? I think you broke up.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, I'm always talking about how comparison is the enemy of joy, right? And especially now with the internet, so many of our young people are digesting these ideas at a rapid rate, and it's unbuffered, you know, as opposed to when we were growing up. You know, we had NWA, et cetera, but these kids, a negative message can be transmitted to the whole world in just one click, right? So you got to imagine young, impressionable minds that don't have the necessary buffers. Think about young people growing up and you commercializing a message. When you look at the messages now, it's all about my op and killing my op, and you have record labels who are jumping to fund that kind of music, because when you look deep into it, it's tied to the prison system, it's tied to the school to prison pipeline, et cetera, et cetera. That's just one phase of it. But these young minds are taking this because the message is, if you kill the other person, if you talk about all these stuff that we didn't, we were bad kids, but when we walked on the church ground, we wouldn't cuss, we wouldn't do nothing. We felt like it was sacred. You know, we had these kind of buffers, but these kids now growing up, they don't have those buffers. The school system is falling apart. The family is broken down. The father's out the household, the mother working long hours, internet raising the kids, these messages raising the kids. So there's not enough positive, healthy messages that's being enforced or reinforced to the kids, so they're left to be raised by these devices and this music that they are emulating. We emulated the music of our times, and these kids are doing the same way. And so that's something that we gotta always challenge. And we challenge that because I say this, and I got this from my prison mentor, Willie Fleming. He taught us 25 years ago. He said, in our communities, the problem is LOL, meaning lack of love. And he told me 25 years ago, he said, you know, the answer and the solution to LOL is LOL. And I said, yeah. He said, lots of love. So we gotta give our communities lots of love. Love, because when you truly have healthy love and you love yourself, that is the only inoculation against the ideas that are being mass produced in our culture. We have young people who don't love themselves, don't have healthy love, minds are not developed, and you feeding them that kind of toxic garbage, you know, we end up with violence being the number one problem in our country. One of the problems, and I won't say number one, but violence being a problem in our communities worldwide, you know, and it's fueled by the ideas that's going, it's fueled by the corporations who are giving these young kids millions of dollars to talk about genocide, et cetera, et cetera. You know, that's a problem. And we have to always continue to speak out against it and inoculate our kids, our communities with love, with real love.
And just to confirm, when you say genocide, you mean the killing Black people in communities, killing
Black
themselves.
people killing Black, exactly. Yeah. And that hatred that come with it.
When in your book, you mentioned going to, and I think we have a few minutes left. In your book, you mentioned going to Russia. Yes. And visiting the ghettos of Russia and the kids there, and how they weren't impressed with anything you were saying until you showed them your bullet wounds.
Right. And
how you went to the prisons and how it was just a horror show in those prisons. And I'm not going to give away the whole book because we want folks to go and buy the book. But I wanted to ask you, how did that impact the way that you saw yourself in a global context, that experience visiting Russia?
It really opened my eyes, because before I went to Russia, I felt like, this one instance, I felt like violence and poverty was hand in hand, right? They went hand in hand. I felt like, and up until that point, I would say that, you know, like, you got violence, you got poverty, so you're gonna have violence. But see, in Russia, I met some kids, and these kids were orphaned, and poverty was high in Russia, right? But these kids was into the arts, they was into the theater, you know, and it blew my mind. Like, young kids was like into the arts, some serious, right? In college, the whole 9 years, they were just into this, and they weren't violent. And it kind of shifted the way, because I was saying, if kids if violence and poverty go together, these kids should be violent, but they weren't. I met some that weren't. They was talking about Beto. Oh, it was crazy. And I was like, whoa, this is deep. They was into jazz music, blew my mind. And it challenged the way I looked at violence and poverty, you know, because again, I said, I thought if you lived in poverty, you know, you automatically be violent, et cetera, because that's what I had seen in my career. But I met young people who wasn't. And then I'm gonna tell you what was the most important thing for me. Our interpreter was a guy named Sasha, right? This guy interpreted our conversations in a way that made me feel like I was talking directly to the people that he was interpreting to. And that was important, because he translated with feelings and everything. I mean, this guy was, I never forget that. And I left coming back to America saying that I had this like epiphany, like, my job is to be an interpreter like Sasha was for my communities, for my young people who can't articulate, who can't talk, who can't speak. I want to be an interpreter that interpret in the same ferocity that he did. You know, I want people to understand the people that I represent. You know, so I'll never forget that I left with that feeling like, man, my job is to be an interpreter just like him for my people, to translate what they can't translate to other people, to understand their pain and what they're going through, and how we best serve and provide resources so that they have upward mobility. That's what I left Russia with. And so it was an eye-opening experience for me.
Okay, I think they said we can do 5 more minutes. So I'm gonna ask you a final question.
Yes.
We know that a great number of Black children are being born into poverty.
Right.
Although we know that poverty doesn't necessarily equal crime, we do know that there are cultural things happening inside the Black community. They're creating this situation, right?
Right.
What is the solution? Because you're doing your work, right?
Right.
And other folks are doing their work, but
Right.
the children are still being born into
Right.
these situations. So how do we address this? Like, what is your idea about that? How do you stop the pipeline of children being born into these situations where they don't have
Right.
the support that they need, right? The love that they need. And
Right. I think, Bev, and that's a great question. I can talk to you forever. You know that, right? You know, I can talk to you all day.
I get that a lot.
You got that warm spirit and personality that just, you know, you make. But to ask your question, I think that that everyone has to continue to do their work, and there is no one fit all kind of solution, that we all got to work and do our part to speak up, to provide information, et cetera, et cetera. You know, I once had this analogy of a boxer, right? That I always say. Uh, and this boxer had the complaint that the crowd was booing him, the judges was on his opponent's side, the referee seemed like he went with the opponent. His own corner appeared to the boxer to be on his opponent's side. And a guy said to that boxer, your only option is to knock him out. He said, knock them out, right? And so I say that to young people in my community, right? I say to them that even as the odds are against you, which they surely will be, especially if you're Black, that you have to knock those odds out. You are responsible for what you do for you. Because I look at it like this, Bev. If I told a young person, the system is against you, the white folks against you, you're born in poverty, you got all these statistics, et cetera, et cetera. I just might surmise as a young kid, why even try? If all that's against me, why even try? And so for me, my message is resilience. My message is no matter what's being thrown at you, no matter what's thrown at you, that you have to hurt. You welcome that. You welcome what's coming at, and you prove people wrong by constantly hurdling whatever. You take obstacles as a part of the mission. When people come to me and say, "Hey, you know, this happened or this happened," and they looking for a different response, I say, "Man, keep going," you know, because I ain't gonna cheat you out of the experience, because it's through those obstacles, through that adversity, that develops your character. So if I try to remove that from you, I might be just cheating you out of your experience, cheating you out of the expertise to be an expert later on in life about that, because I truly believe that our story, what we go through, whether the adversity, the pain, the triumph, all that stuff we go through is our medicine. And our medicine is to be shared with the world. My book is medicine that I took, that I'm sharing with the world, because I want it to be just as when I read Nathan McCall, just as I read Victor Frankl, just as I read Alex Haley or Dennis Kimbrough, those or Amos Wilson or Naeem Akbar. When I was reading those books, they were giving me medicine. And they medicine helped me move forward. And so I don't try to remove those obstacles from people. We have to do it. Do we challenge those systems that's unjust? Yes, we challenge those systems that's unjust. We hold those systems accountable, but we inspiring our kids to overcome these obstacles, because they gonna happen. We can't remove those obstacles. So that's how I would answer that, Bev.
All right. Thank you so much, Antong. It was an incredible conversation.
Thank you.
I encourage everyone to get the book.
Yes. That book is good. That's a good book, and I promise everybody that's listening that you're gonna get something out of that book that's applicable to your life, because I wrote it in that way that you just discover something that you can identify with, and that's gonna be a jewel for you. And if you care about somebody, send that book to them. Just as someone sent me Nathan McCall book that opened my eye, that changed my trajectory in prison, I want this book to do the same. I believe it will. So I'm excited. This is a great conversation. Thank you, Town Hall Seattle.
Yes,
My
thank you,
pleasure,
Town Hall.
Susanna. Thank
Absolutely, for
you.
giving us the platform.
Thank you. Yes.
Well, excellent. Thank you so much to both Anton Lucky and Beverly Aarons for joining us this evening. And thank you to our town hall audience at home. It was so amazing getting to hear your stories and the work that you do. It's all just so wonderful to have you both here tonight. Be sure to pick up your copy of the book from Third Place Books via the link in the chat. And on behalf of Town Hall, thank you all for being here and have a great night.